Hi, welcome to Neuroverse
A podcast hosted by Clara
and Carolina, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is on noise in the brain. So we're going to start by exploring the question of what does this mean? What is noise in the brain? And then we'll go on to discuss a little bit about what the purpose of noise could be for brain functioning.
And potentially the different types of noise and what we mean by them.
Exactly. Okay, so I'm sure many of you have heard of brain waves and brain oscillations, the same thing, as we've referred to in some of our previous episodes as well. And these are recurring patterns of brain activity that follow regular rhythms and come in certain frequencies, for example, gamma or alpha, beta. But there's also a type of activity that isn't so regular, which is noise. And this is not that different from the static you may see on a TV, which doesn't follow a particular timescale or frequency.
Okay.
There is a special type of noise which is of particular interest in research, and this is called pink noise.
I've never heard of pink noise.
It's really cool. I found that it's called pink noise because pink visible light has the same power spectrum as this type of noise, so the same sort of shape of waves.
That's so cool. I love that.
Yeah, and it's also referred to as 1/f noise because the main characteristic of this type of noise is that power decreases with increasing frequency. So the amplitude of the oscillations are inversely proportional to the frequency. So with a higher frequency, you have a lower amplitude. With a lower frequency, you have a higher amplitude.
Okay. So what is pink noise in the brain?
This type of brain activity is essentially spontaneous brain activity, and people don't really understand what it means. And of course, as it's so spontaneous and asynchronous, it has never really been considered much to have any sort of meaning, and instead just thought of sort of background noise. But more recent studies have found that it may actually be extremely significant in how our brains process information that we take in from the world.
Okay.
So to explain it sort of metaphorically, I guess, from the perspective of noise, we're kind of all like these little receivers that have a specific baseline activity.
Okay.
And then the dynamic between this baseline activity, which is the noise, which seems meaningless, but it defines how we actually take in information and integrate that information.
Cool. Okay, so this baseline activity is the pink noise.
Yes.
And because we have this baseline activity, it then allows us to receive and perceive information.
Yes, and it affects how we do perceive the information.
So interesting. Can I ask how, I don't know if this is relevant, but how it differs from like the default mode network?
Oh, that's a good question. So the default mode network is a specific circuit in the brain or pathway that is thought to be involved in our daydreaming, mind-wandering mode. And it's very much implicated in how we view ourselves. Like, it's basically our self-narrative.
Yeah.
But this is a network, like a physical network. And it can increase and decrease in activity during certain cognitive tasks. So noise is something that happens throughout the whole brain, and it's spontaneous activity.
Okay.
So how I view noise is that it can occur throughout different networks, including the default mode network.
Okay, cool.
But what is especially interesting about pink noise or 1/f noise is it appears to potentially be a phenomena that occurs throughout many biological and physical systems.
Oh, really?
Throughout nature.
Oh my god.
Yeah. So, for example, seismic waves like earthquake activity,
Okay.
tide and river heights, the way that the heart beats. Some meteorological data, which is especially interesting because we all know the weather is like impossible to predict. And even the way that we speak, so speech as well as musical melodies actually can tend towards a 1/f dynamic. And even Brownian motion, which is the random motion of particles, and even stock market fluctuations.
Oh my god.
Which is like the whole other end of the scale. Yeah, it's
we should
incredible.
We should get a physicist on here and like perhaps help explain why this 1/f is so important.
Yeah. I think it's being researched increasingly to see if it could be a sort of like underlying principle of systems, biological systems. But at the same time, studies have shown that although they all may follow this 1/f or tend towards this 1/f dynamic, it occurs kind of at different scales. So the steepness of the power spectrum can be altered in these different phenomena. And within noise in the brain, the steepness can also be modulated during different tasks, which is especially interesting because this then leads me to one potential very huge implication of what noise means. That when we're taking in sensory stimuli or performing tasks like movement, etc., then the steepness of the power spectrum has been found to decrease.
Oh, okay.
And this may be essentially to give way for active processing. So it's like, you kind of take away the noise so that meaningful patterns can emerge.
Oh, yes, that makes sense.
Yeah. And during sleep, on the other hand, during REM sleep, it was found that the slope was steeper.
It was steeper.
And so it was suggested that these noise signals may serve as a signature of one's state of consciousness.
Ah, okay. As well as a signal of perhaps activity and receiving sensory stimuli.
Yeah, well, both, because it influences how we perceive sensory stimuli. So, for example, in REM sleep, we don't want to be taking in visual stimuli, audio stimuli.
Yeah.
What is happening around us. We're in our own worlds. So maybe that's why it's more noisy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And linked to this, which is something we discussed, I think you mentioned this in an episode where we were talking about sleep and how one purpose of sleep may be to facilitate inferences and the formation of creative thoughts. Yeah, well, I was reading, there's an excellent book on noise written by Edmund Rolls and Gustavo Deco. It's called The Noisy Brain. And they did mention that noise may facilitate creativity. So if there was no noise, then if we were to recall a memory or repeat a thought, then it would always occur in the same way. But with noise, then it can statistically shift the probability of going through one pathway or another pathway in the brain in a semi-random way. And this can then, push the activity of the brain in one direction or another. And there's so many possibilities for the way it can go that this outcome is creative thought.
Oh, wow. Okay, so I have a couple questions about that. Okay, they did conclude that it outputs in creative thought, but how can we know that these random activities are significant? Like, how significant are they statistically to the original output versus the noisy output, which relates into a creative thought? My second thing is, oh my god, maybe this could this could explain, for example, subjectivity and why it's impossible for two people to perceive the exact same, perceive and integrate the exact same stimuli.
Okay, just gonna address your second point first because I don't know if I'm able to address your first one, but I think subjectivity though does really, this is personal opinion here.
Yes, go.
It does majorly boil down to your memories.
Okay.
Because the information you're taking in, I kind of view as always being integrated into your current state of mind.
Yes, but
and this is so determined by your memories.
But if even that integration fluctuates due to noise.
Yeah. So so I have a good example of this. I was listening to an excellent podcast where it was an interview with Georg Northoff. So he was essentially explaining that a different way that we could conceptualize neurodiversity or brain disorders is through noise, and the fact that changes in noise affects how our brains interact with the world, and therefore how we perceive things and how we behave, inputs and outputs.
Oh my god.
And I did some more research and found that they carried out a study in 2021 on schizophrenia patients, and they compared schizophrenia patients with non-schizophrenia participants. Okay, so in schizophrenia, there tends to be behaviorally a delay in reaction time. So there's what they call less temporal precision in carrying out a task or responding to sensory stimuli. And there's also less trial-to-trial coherence, so more variability trial-to-trial. And they then they tried to measure noise in the brain using EEG, and they found that the behavioral decreases in temporal precision were related to a lower signal-to-noise ratio, meaning more noise in schizophrenia brains. Yeah, which just speaks to the point that the amount of noise in your brain can really affect your perceptual experience. Yeah, and that's obviously comparing like schizophrenia and normal non-schizophrenia participants, but it would be really interesting to compare just a group of people who are seemingly similar.
We could do a study with, controls. For example, twins. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and so two people who have seemingly grown up the same way, same genes, relatively similar.
But maybe that would mean they have similar amount of noise.
Oh.
Which is another interesting point, because I don't think much is known about what determines the noise.
Yeah,
since it's
I was thinking
spontaneous
that,
activity.
How much, well, I'm sure they do, but to what extent does the biological composition matter? And if so, like, how does that then tie into the noise? Like, where's the noise stored? Like, how does it bounce off the neurons and stuff?
It is the neurons, though.
Yeah.
There's a couple of theories, but I don't think any of these have been properly tested as to what actually creates noise, like neurophysiologically.
What if...
You look so suspicious.
I was gonna say, well, what if it's to do with perhaps the cellular composition of neurons? What if it's to do with post-transcriptional modification of proteins?
It definitely could be. One of the hypotheses is that it actually reflects the balance between excitation and inhibition in the brain.
Okay, that makes sense.
So there's excitatory neurons, and then there's inhibitory neurons that kind of...
As well as excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters.
Yeah, and so overall, there's a balance between excitation and inhibition. Every time, like within a neural circuit, for example, it's not just like one neuron excites the next, excites the next, excites the next. It's much more complex, and then there's one neuron excites one that's inhibiting another, it's exciting another, and inhibiting another.
And inhibiting the other.
And that's disinhibition, and then there's inhibition of disinhibition.
Yes, exactly. And there's feed forward and feedback, inhibition, and Yeah,
it's complicated. But overall, there's then a balance of excitation and inhibition, which is also known to be affected in a lot of neurodevelopmental disorders, including schizophrenia, and this may affect noise. So that's one possibility. Another is that it just reflects the brain's physical organization, which again is just really complex because that entails so much.
Yes, yeah.
Another thing I found is noise has been shown to be altered throughout life depending on your developmental stage. So specifically with aging, this is pink noise that we're mainly talking about. Well, you probably heard of white noise. This is not the same as pink noise because let's just say, even simple, it's a bit less noisy than pink noise. So it's like a noise that's a bit, it's a regular noise.
Wait, so is white noise, are we talking about the same white noise that like some people use to fall asleep?
Exactly.
Oh. How is there white noise in the brain? Or is this just like an auditory stimuli?
Well, basically noise just means a wave, right? Like a wave function.
Yeah.
And so white, pink, these are just fancy names to describe the complex mathematics. So that's the difference, that they have different functions that describe the waveforms.
Okay, so what is the function of white noise in the brain?
Oh, like the function. When I said function, I meant like mathematical function.
Okay. No, I know. But like,
okay. Yeah.
Like pink noise, we know a little bit that it's like the background noise that allows us to like receive inputs.
Yeah.
More or less. What is white noise?
I don't really know what white noise is.
Okay.
But it has been shown that as the brain ages, it becomes noisier in that there is an increased amount of white noise.
Ah, okay. Okay, interesting.
And again, this relates to the slope of the power function of the noise. So with white noise, this slope approaches 0. So it has a more flat structure. Mm-hmm. And this has been found to increase with age, as well as be related to decreased working memory performance in age. So that's a preliminary step for further studies that could investigate then, well, what is producing this noise and why it increases with age.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, but perhaps that could provide some clues as to what underlies it.
Mm-hmm.
One paper that I found really interesting about the potential role of neural noise. A recent study in 2021 found that noise in neural activity may underlie the uncertainty element of our experience recalling a memory.
Yeah.
So during a memory task, the signals from neuroimaging fMRI, it's known to encode performance during this task. But a group of neuroscientists at NYU, they postulated that the statistical distribution of the noise amongst these signals may also encode something, specifically the uncertainty that people have of their memories. So they got their participants to undergo a visual working memory task, meaning they're presented with an image and then it goes away and then they have to reciprocate that and try to recall what it was. Mm-hmm. And they actually found that indeed the statistical noise in the fMRI data was correlated with what people reported, how much they were uncertain of their memory.
Okay, so what areas lit up in the fMRI?
It was the visual cortex because the task was visual memory.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was mainly the visual cortex. But of course, fMRI data is very messy. Mm-hmm. It's very noisy in itself.
Yeah.
So this could mean two things, though. This could mean like, oh, can we trust it?
Yeah.
But it could also mean if they found a correlation amongst the noise of the noisiness, then maybe it's actually quite significant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I also wonder how far this can go in terms of like not only the uncertainty of memories but perhaps like pseudo memories and thinking something happened to you and it didn't.
Yeah.
And whether or not it either activates the same way as an actual memory or if it has the same uncertainty type of noise.
Yes, like what we were saying about creativity. So maybe you get sparked by stimuli, and that's like a partial memory cue. Mm-hmm. And then the noise that so happens to be in that moment pushes your brain activity in a certain direction that creates the false memory. Mm-hmm. And so that means the noise actually plays a huge part in creating the false memory or the pseudo memory.
Yeah, potentially.
Yeah, so it's like this silent river of consciousness that's guiding your brain in certain directions to ultimately determine your conscious experience.
Another type of noise, but in terms of perception, is they did this study where they wanted to assess difficulty of a task versus noise in a task. And what I mean by this type of noise is, so they had 2 images of a male and a female, and the person was to identify whether the image was a male or a female. Mm-hmm. And then they added noise to the images where they just made it a bit more hazy to see whether the noise took,
like the sensorial noise.
Exactly, whether the sensorial noise took more of an effort to reach a decision. Or they also did another thing where they swapped male and female features across the faces. So the difficulty of the task increased. Mm-hmm. And so they wanted to compare the gender morphing difficulty as well as the noise present in the images to brain activity. So what they noticed is that with an increase in noise and like a lower resolution, this caused an increase in the visual cortical demands.
So a more noisy picture, like an image that's less clear, basically, it increases the demand for brain activity to process it.
Yes, and specifically in the visual cortex.
Yeah. Well, yeah, as it's a visual task, but perhaps the same would occur with music.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting because I love listening to jazz that sounds like nothing and then just finding the pattern within the noise.
Yeah. I feel like that's a very human thing, to find the pattern in
Yes,
the noise.
which it's kind of the whole premise of our episode on reductionism, about how humans always find the need to find a pattern in the most abstract of
or simply projecting their own like thoughts and contextual information onto a painting.
Yes, as well as auditory art.
Yeah.
On that note, I hope that you enjoyed today's episode on noise in the brain. Be sure to check out our website for all of the resources, the papers we mentioned, and don't forget to answer our questions on the Spotify, and we'd love to hear your feedback.